I think one of the best litmus tests for just how far the video game industry has really fallen is to go back and look at what female video game character design used to look like and how they used to handle that compared to what we get now. Because as I mentioned in my last video, I feel like a character like Abby from The Last of Us Part 2 is really the pinnacle of this new hyper-feminist, politicized, extremely unaesthetic new form of character design that is really, it's intended to almost insult the player, to berate the player and to say, oh, you want to play as like a cute-looking feminine woman, do you? Well, fuck you, you misogynist piece of shit. Like, that is the kind of character design that we are now subject to across the board in terms of Western gaming. Now, thankfully, Japan is still working hard to keep the torch lit when it comes to quality waifus, and hats off to them, but the Western industry has just fallen so hard, and it's reached the point where it's absurd, it's almost like a self-parody, and it's clear that the people creating these games they're so embedded in their own ideology, and they're so full of hate, that they've really forgotten that their job is to produce entertainment, and the entertainment is going to be consumed by majority straight men, right? That is the target audience of gaming, no matter how much they tell themselves that there's this invisible block of disabled trans women of color just waiting to invest hundreds in video game pre-orders, season passes, Chinese plastic fluff. They're pretty vocal about how they do not need to cater to the perspective or the tastes of the traditional video game purchasing demographic. So we've been told en masse to go fuck ourselves. And yeah, and that's just the consensus when it comes to modern video games. And I've spoken a lot about it in the past. But this video, I want to turn our attention back to the old way that things used to be done. And let's actually look and see if any of these old school female video game characters were really that distasteful and quote-unquote misogynistic as these broomstick-riding fucking land whales that have taken over our industry claim. So I think, first things first, I want to talk about some of my personal favorite female video game characters, unironically. So I think Lara Croft is a cool character, and I'm not talking about any of the other iterations when it comes to multimedia, not the Angelina Jolie movies or the other, whatever the other reboot was recently, which just, I mean, the woman they got to play, Lara, I mean, what is going on? Especially when it came to the rack, right? Like, what's going on? The new version of Lara, the Crystal Dynamics new reboot, not a fan of that either. She's just this muddy, po-faced, annoying-looking, salty campus feminist. I'm talking about OG Lara. OG Lara is extremely based, for one thing, because she is unapologetically upper class, and she lives in Croft Manor, which looks like it's somewhere in Cambridge or something. She has a butler. She's fucking rich. She inherited a huge fortune from her upper-class father, right? And she lives in the lap of luxury while she intermittently jet-sets off to different exotic locales in search of treasure. She is a quote-unquote Tomb Raider, right? And she does it with this smirking, kind of sassy attitude, which is the complete polar opposite of new Lara. Like, new Lara is all vulnerable and, oh, she doesn't know if she's strong enough to, like, it's this irritating, extremely cliched character archetype, which you see constantly on Netflix and in modern media, and it's fucking lame. The thing about original Lara is that she is just unashamedly a badass. She embodies that kind of wry, almost smug spirit of the British Empire, where, she is just going to take what she wants. She will expand her horizons across the globe, but always from this almost high Tory perspective, where she's in it for the treasure, and she's in it for the feeling of conquest, and it's that smirk that old school Lara has that just, you can't help but love it. It's fantastic. And old Lara doesn't strike me as a woman that really gives a shit about, oh, what about the indigenous natives of this jungle? She's like, no, she's after the treasure, and she'll happily gun down animals, bears, like natives if they get in her way, and she'll do it while quipping. Whereas new Lara seems to only be fighting like kind of power-tripping white military men, and that just was not the kind of game that the original Tomb Raider games were. That they were like Lara versus nature. Lara versus the unknown, perilous creatures and dangerous contraptions and traps. And that vibe that those old games had really speaks to the European Faustian spirit, the safari man, the explorer that wants to discover the secrets of like the pyramids and stuff like that. That is what Lara's all about. She's kind of like this female British upper-class Indiana Jones. Does Indiana Jones ever actually end up keeping the treasure? Does he ever actually make off with real booty? I mean, he always seems to be this kind of down-on-his-luck history professor in his daily life, right? Whereas Lara is literally fucking rich. And she keeps the treasure. She has a treasure room in her fucking mansion, right? And she has that base feminine desire for the material, jewels and treasure and like shiny things, right? Plus, when you take into account her character design itself, it's on point. It fits with the setting, and it's not over the top. Like, you get so much lip service paid to the idea that Lara has ridiculously big boobs. It's like she's got a fairly ample bosom, right? I mean, that is part of her character, but that's the thing. She's a feminine woman, and her outfit is more utilitarian than it is some kind of ridiculous, over-designed, sexy outfit. I mean, it's literally like, shorts, that green spandex top, and, then she's got her holsters, and that's all she needs, and a little backpack, right? Makes perfect sense, but you always hear like, oh yeah, Lara's just a big pair of tits. Like, whatever. That's her design. And you know what? Men, like when I was like 12 years old, I was playing Tomb Raider, and I'm like, this is awesome. That's why she's got big boobs, guys. Like, she was designed by a man who thought, what would make this character a little bit more awesome? She had some pretty big booba, right? And thus, it was made, and it was done, okay? And we saw the booba, and we saw that it was good. And that really was the attitude of developers back in the 90s. It was that, look, we're making video games because we want to make them entertaining, and we are not above a little cheesecake to sweeten the deal. And that just shows you how carefree and fun a pre-third wave feminist video game industry used to be. It was the best. Moving on, another classic female video game character I quite enjoy is Jill Valentine from the original Resident Evil, and then you can also include the remake as well, the GameCube remake version of Jill, which I think nails the aesthetics, because she's just top-tier waifu material in that game. But she's a player character in a game where you can choose between either the male main character, Chris Redfield, or you can go with Jill. And the way that Resident Evil treats this, it's a gendered choice at the end of the day, is kind of cool. And it's actually refreshing when you compare it to what we get these days, where if you're going to play as a female character, she's going to be overpowered. She's going to be this Mary Sue that she can do everything that the male character can do plus 10, right? Whereas the dichotomy of Jill versus Chris is perfectly handled and actually is reflected in these systems of Resident Evil, the actual gameplay as well. Ultimately, you could look at the choice between Chris and Jill as a difficulty select, and I guess a Sarkeesian critical analysis of this would be like, oh yeah, well, the woman is the easy mode, and that's insulting. It's like, no, it's not. It's consistent and actually quite realistic, because here's the thing. Jill, what she lacks in physical strength, she makes up for in other areas. Like, for one thing, she's a trained locksmith, therefore she has access to the lockpick before, or I don't even think Chris even gets the lockpick, right? But that makes the early game for Jill slightly easier. The fact that she's a woman too means that she is subject to the protection of Barry, right? Because Barry is constantly checking in with Jill, gets her out of that room that's going to crush her, turn her into the Jill pancake, the classic line, right? That's the thing. It's that it looks like Barry's masculine instinct to protect comes into play and ends up saving Jill's ass, whereas Chris is on his own, just like we men must stand alone in this world, right? There's that archetypal truth there, reflected by the fact that, hey, you know what, Jill benefits from the helping hand of a patriarchal man who will put himself in danger to try and protect her. So there you go. And anyone that doesn't like what I just said there, you can go fuck yourself, because it is the truth, right? That does happen, and it's happened throughout human history. Men have died on behalf of women and died in the place of women, because that's just the way we are. We are human beings. So I think Resident Evil is cool just for even having these little touches there. I mean, fact is though, at the same time, Jill cannot take as much abuse as Chris. Chris is tougher. Physically he's tougher. He can take more damage. So it does change the way you play, and it does have an element that rings true when it comes to the two characters. So It's just fucking cool. Like, you just don't get that. That would be offensive if they put that mechanic into a game in our current paused industry climate. But moving on from Resident Evil, huge Final Fantasy fan here. My most popular video is just me spurging about the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Not even my usual content. I don't mention anything edgy or political in the whole video. I'm just shitting on the remake. But anyway, it's so difficult to choose, like, which FF waifu would be my favorite, because there's too many good examples of positive, feminine, well-written, well-designed characters that you just love, right? So I guess you could go back to 7. And the thing about 7 is that it's fundamentally a love triangle when it comes to your relationship with the female characters. You got Aeris and you have Tifa, right? They're the two big female characters in that game. And it's the eternal battle for a man's heart, right? It's the girly girl versus the tomboy. That's how I see it. And to this day, gamers are debating which one is the true top-tier waifu. And the answer is, there is no answer, okay? It really is the kind of man that you are, right? And, you know, Tifa's like the girl next door who is this rough and tumble. She fights with her fists, and she's got absolutely huge booba, right? So it's the booba mixed with the tomboy. Aeris is a bit more demure, you know, she's shy, she's very girly, she sells flowers, you know, she represents that naturalistic side of the feminine, you know. The last descendant of this Hyperborean race of superhumans, and she is connected to the planet in a way that none of the other characters are. So she is this kind of representation of the healing aspect of the feminine, the nurturing side, the side connected with nature, whereas Tifa is a bit more of the rough and tumble, you know, like she is that down-to-earth barmaid that you love. And you can grab a few beers with her, right? And she can handle her own with the boys, right? So I'll leave it at that, but there you go. I mean, geez, how could you choose? How could you choose? It's tough. It's a tough one. You could call them, you know, the ideal woman in a way. Two sides of the ideal woman in terms of what men want, designed and written by male creators who understand what men find appealing. And neither of them are offensive. That's the funny thing. Neither of them are like the most gross, offensive insult to women. Not even close to being pornographic or degrading. And yet, we don't get characters like Aeris and Tifa anymore. Especially Tifa, who is the tomboy, right? And one of the disturbing things I've observed over the last however many years in our culture is the complete eradication of the tomboy in terms of women. Like, you don't get tomboys anymore because women are now raised and brainwashed to think that, oh, well, if you have masculine interests or you feel like you're a little less feminine than other women, well, then you need to take testosterone and cut your tits off. And that's the solution. And frankly, I find this completely insane, and it's tragic, actually, because so many men, you ask any man, and there's nothing more rare and awesome than a woman that you can kind of relate to in terms of male hobbies and interests, right? That's not indicative of some kind of gender dysphoria, right? It's not like we need surgery and propaganda to correct that. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in, and the FF series has had some pretty classic tomboys. I think that Dagger, aka Princess Garnet from FF9, is another good example because she's forced into the role of the princess, but she also has this interest in the common folk. She's fascinated with the way that the plebs live and wants to experience some of that lifestyle, and that's kind of part of her character arc, is learning how to let go of her aristocratic roots and discovering her true lineage, which is pretty cool. I'd say Riku from FF10 is another one. She's, you know, into mechanics and technology, and her entire specialty is dismantling machines. And, you know, she also represents the thief archetype, but she's another cool little tomboy in FF, and quite an interesting contrast to her cousin Yuna, who is the main girl of 10, who is a very Asian-style waifu. She is very traditional, very feminine, and she upholds the tradition of the society that she's in as part of this religious priestess class. So absolutely based. And I could go on. I don't want to fixate too much on FF, but Rinoa from FF8 is another one. She is that tsundere waifu, you know, the one that at first encounter you find yourself at odds with. There's a lot of bickering, and, you know, she's feisty. It's that Japanese stereotypical tsundere that you gotta love. And the Japanese, they absolutely love this particular dynamic between men and women. This borderline confrontational tension, and with the woman being very just uppity and kind of like on the guy's case, breaking his balls a little bit. But then eventually she slips and reveals that she's really, really into him, right? There's this Japanese thing going on, which I don't think as Westerners we can fully appreciate, but I find it amusing and I do enjoy that dynamic. I mean, Asuka and Shinji from Evangelion is another great example of tsundere. So I think Rinoa fits that category. And I'm not saying that Rinoa is a tomboy. I was just mentioning her as another classic FF waifu who is awesome. So I also want to mention Maria/Mary from Silent Hill 2, one of my favorite games ever, right? And it's a game that doesn't need much introduction. I don't want to go into too much detail about the plot, right? But here's the thing about Silent Hill 2, right? The main character is this tortured man, James Sunderland, and he's drawn back to the town of Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his dead wife. And as you explore the town, you encounter this woman, Maria, who is the spitting image of Mary, James's wife, but almost the polar opposite in terms of personality. Where Mary was this conservative and good-natured woman, Maria is chaotic and promiscuous. She is extremely judgmental of James, tears him down constantly, and in terms of her visual design, I mean, she's identical to Mary, but she dresses like a thought, right? She wears a short skirt, she's got like a colored streak dyed into her hair. She's James's Coomer fantasy version of his own deceased wife, made manifest by the dark, Lovecraftian essence of the Silent Hill town, right? Like, who knows? They don't explain why she came into existence, but these two characters, Mary and Maria, really represent the concept of the Madonna whore. It's that there's this male proclivity to see women either as the saint or the harlot, and this is a Freudian concept. I'm usually not a big fan of Freud. I'm more of a Jungian, but I like this idea, and it's something that definitely affects younger men, especially men of my generation, the millennial generation. We've been raised with Hollywood entertainment and propaganda that really does embed the notion that women are these infallible, angelic creatures, and this ultimately does lead to disappointment. I think that's part of a man's journey from youth to manhood, is integrating this Madonna whore complex, right? Because you have to accept that no, women are not saints and they're not whores. They are a chaotic blend of the two. And you need to come to terms with this as a man. It's one of the hardest things to do, I think, as a millennial man, because it shatters not only your preconceived understanding of women, but also of our society. And it leads ultimately to the reassessment of everything. And it's one of the first big red pills that a lot of men end up taking. And I think it's so fucking bold of Silent Hill 2 to even go into this kind of territory here. But Silent Hill 2 is full of weird Freudian stuff. Like, the designers of Silent Hill 2, they recognize that Freud is fucking weird, Like, Freud makes me uncomfortable, some of his ideas. And these Japanese devs, they went, yeah, I see some potential there for body horror and just making this game even more uncomfortable. Let's capitalize on it. So you gotta tip your cap to that. I mean, that is awesome, and it's another example of how the legacy Japanese video game industry is second to none. It is God tier, or as they probably put it, S tier.